The most disturbing thing about the outsider isn't what he sees in that mirror. It's how long he didn't know.
Right. It is the ultimate horror of the unexamined self. And, if you're sitting there with us right now in this lamplit library, just listening to the rain beat against the heavy glass of the window panes, understand that we are not opening this dossier tonight to recount some simple Gothic ghost story.
No, absolutely not. Our mission for this deep dive is to treat this document as a raw confession.
To understand the mechanics of that horror, I think we have to start by really immersing ourselves in the environment where that innocence was incubated. We have to look at the architecture of his isolation.
Let's lay it out.
So if you analyze the opening testimony of this account, the narrator's reality is entirely defined by sensory deprivation and, decay. He lives in this sprawling, infinitely old castle of brown hangings, surrounded by maddening rows of antique books.
Just endless rows of them.
Right. And the stones in the corridors are hideously damp. The trees outside the windows are so massive they actually block out the sun, which creates this permanent, suffocating twilight.
A literal permanent shadow.
And there is a pervasive, inescapable smell. He describes it specifically as the piled-up corpses of dead generations.
I have to stop you there, cuz the mechanics of that isolation are what absolutely baffle me.
Yep.
It's not just that he's in a dark, smelly castle, right?
No.
It's an environment of total unnatural stagnation. He claims he has never heard a human voice.
Mm-hmm.
He hasn't even heard his own voice because it simply, never occurred to him to try and speak aloud.
Which is wild.
Right. How does a conscious entity even form an identity in a vacuum like that?
Well, that is the crucial psychological question here. What happens when the human brain is just starved of external feedback? Because neurologically speaking, the brain abhors a void.
Right, it has to fill it.
Exactly. If you put someone in a sensory deprivation tank for long enough, they don't just experience nothingness. Their brain actually starts hallucinating to fill the empty space. And in this file, the narrator constructs an entire sense of self from those dusty, moldy books.
He reads about knights and lords.
Yeah, youthful figures. And because he has no mirrors, no reflective surfaces whatsoever in this entire castle, he just assumes he looks like the heroes in the books.
Which is a staggering level of cognitive dissonance. Let's look at what the evidence actually says. He writes that he merely regarded himself by instinct as akin to those painted figures.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, he admits that he finds the skeletons in the crypts to be more natural than the colored pictures of living beings.
Yeah, there's a huge disconnect there.
Absolutely. He is surrounded by death. He smells like death. He literally relates to the dead. But he still imagines himself as this living, breathing, beautiful youth.
It's an identity built entirely on a lack of data.
But the human mind can only sustain a delusion of that magnitude for so long, right? Before the subconscious essentially demands a reckoning.
Yeah, the pressure builds.
His longing for light, for truth, it becomes frantic. He decides to scale the one black, ruined tower that reaches above the forest canopy. He explicitly states that it is better to glimpse the sky and perish than to live without beholding day.
And that climb is where the file shifts from a description of a static environment to an active psychological rupture. We have to decode this ascent because it is an agonizing, frantic scramble up a dead, stairless cylinder of rock.
Just clinging to the walls.
Clinging perilously to these tiny footholds in the pitch black, surrounded by startled bats, and it takes hours. He describes it as an infinity of awesome, sightless, crawling up a desperate precipice.
Pushing his physical and mental limits.
To the absolute brink, expecting to eventually look out of a window and see the moon and the stars from this dizzying, terrifying height.
There's a contradiction in the record here, though.
Yeah.
This is where the physical geography of the narrative completely breaks down.
Yeah.
And I need us to pull this apart.
Okay, let's look at it.
Let's analyze the structural reality of what he actually finds. He hits a solid stone barrier, pushes a heavy slab, crawls through a trapdoor, and instead of being at the dizzying pinnacle of a tower, hundreds of feet in the air, he steps out onto solid ground.
It's a graveyard overshadowed by an ancient stone church.
Right.
He climbs for hours upward, vertically, only to emerge in a ground-level cemetery. Geographically, that is impossible. It defies every law of physics.
Because it isn't physics, it's the architecture of a dissociative state.
Explain that.
He isn't climbing out of a physical subterranean dungeon. He is clawing his way out of a buried psychological state. The tower isn't made of masonry, it's made of repression. But if it's purely repression, why does his mind force him to climb? Repression is a defense mechanism. It's designed by the brain to keep us safe from trauma.
So the castle in this document isn't just a spooky backdrop.
What is it then?
It is the inherited institution of his own mind.
I'm not fully convinced it's that clean of a metaphor, though. Look at the literary scaffolding he's using.
You mean the classical elements?
Yes, the decaying masonry, the crumbling family estate. He is consciously drawing on a very specific Gothic lineage here. The epigraph at the beginning of the file is from John Keats. That night the Baron dreamt of many a woe, and all his warrior guests, with shade and form of witch and demon and large coffin worm, were long be-nightmared. And structurally, there are massive, undeniable echoes of Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, where the physical collapse of the ancestral home represents the genetic and psychological ruin of the family line. Lovecraft is deliberately using this classical literary architecture.
He is using it, yes, but as a shield.
A shield.
The Gothic tropes are the only way he can safely approach his own terror. The fiction provides a layer of plausible deniability,
Interesting.
It allows him to explore his deepest dread that he is fundamentally broken, inherently monstrous, genetically doomed, without having to actually state it as a medical or personal fact. He knows, on a deep subconscious level, that outside his isolation lies a truth he cannot endure. The ultimate tragedy of his early existence isn't that he is trapped, it's that the trap was keeping him safe.
The delusion was armor.
The institution of his mind, that delusion, was the only thing protecting him from the reality of what he was.
Right up until the craving for the light, for reality, becomes just too strong to ignore. Which brings us to the catalyst of this entire case file. The collision between the delusion and the truth.
The climax.
After he escapes the graveyard, he wanders through the open country for hours. He crosses a swift river where a bridge has long vanished and finally reaches his goal. An ivy-covered castle in a wooded park.
A castle that he describes as maddeningly familiar, yet full of perplexing strangeness.
It's heavily implied this is his actual ancestral home, or at least the real-world equivalent to the fantasy he'd been living in. But it has been altered by time. And unlike his dark prison, this place is gorgeously ablaze with light.
He can finally see.
He looks through the open windows and sees a company of people, beautifully dressed, making merry, and he decides to step through the low window into the brilliantly lighted room. He crosses the threshold from the isolated dark into the shared reality of the light.
And the moment he steps from his single bright hope into reality, he unleashes absolute, unmitigated chaos.
Total panic.
The transition is instantaneous. He writes that scarcely had he crossed the sill when a sudden and unheralded fear of hideous intensity descended upon the entire room. Every face distorts. The most horrible screams erupt.
Just a primal, animal panic.
People are fainting, they're being dragged away by fleeing companions, they are overturning furniture, blindingly plunging toward the doors to escape the room.
And he is left entirely alone in this brilliant apartment, listening to the vanishing echoes of their screams. I want to put a microscope on the exact physical mechanism of what happens next.
Okay.
Because the entire philosophical weight of this document hinges on a single tactile sensation. He is paralyzed by the sight of this leering, bone-revealing travesty of the human shape. He staggers forward to avoid falling. He becomes agonizingly aware of the nearness of this rotting thing.
He can actually hear its hideous, hollow breathing.
He is literally face to face with the abyss. And in a desperate bid to protect himself, he throws out a hand to ward off the apparition. He reaches out to stop the monster from advancing, and his fingers touch the rotting, outstretched paw of the creature.
But he doesn't feel rotting flesh.
The golden arched doorway wasn't a doorway to another room. It was a gilded frame.
The moment his fingers touch that cold, unyielding glass, his reality collapses.
The psychological violence of that moment is staggering. He writes that all the fiendish ghouls that ride the night winds shrieked for him, because in that fraction of a second, the touch of the glass triggers what he calls a single and fleeting avalanche of soul-annihilating memory.
He remembers everything.
He remembers who he is,
What he is, and how long he has been dead. He recognizes the altered edifice in which he stands. Most devastatingly, he recognizes the unholy abomination staring back at him. It is the ultimate confirmation that the monster isn't out there. The monster is the observer. Think about how subversive this is.
In what way?
The core engine of the Gothic tradition is usually the intrusion of the supernatural into the normal world, right? The vampire at the window, the ghost in the hall. The protagonist is the normal human suffering the unnatural intrusion.
Standard horror setup.
But this record inverts that entirely. The narrator is the unnatural intrusion. He is the infection ruining the normal world. And the realization of that fact annihilates him.
The document details a very specific, chilling reaction. He doesn't fall to his knees and weep. He doesn't try to explain himself to the fleeing crowd. He experiences a profound psychological shutdown. He flees from the lit castle, runs silently in the moonlight, and returns to the graveyard. He tries the stone trapdoor to go back down into his dark, isolated mental institution, but it is immovable.
He can never go back down into the comforting ignorance of his old delusions.
The door to his innocence is permanently locked,
Yeah.
but he explicitly states that he is not sorry. He hated the antique castle and the trees anyway.
So he finds a new existence.
He does. He rides with the mocking and friendly ghouls on the night wind. He plays by day in the catacombs of the Nile. He seeks the rock tombs and the unnamed feasts beneath the Great Pyramid.
The true horror, the payload that Lovecraft is delivering to us through this confession, is the realization that once you see your own dark alien nature, you can never again exist among those who are still men.
You are permanently exiled from humanity. Let's open the biographical dossier on Lovecraft's life around 1921.
It's incredibly dark. The record paints a devastating portrait of a man suffocating in his own mind.
Suffocating is the right word. Look at the timeline here. The historical files show that from 1908 to 1914, Lovecraft withdrew from society almost entirely.
Just shut himself away.
He lived as a hermit, barely leaving his room, suffering from what were termed nervous breakdowns. And crucially, he composed this specific document shortly after a severely traumatic period.
His mother.
Yes, the institutionalization and subsequent death of his mother, Susie. They had a notoriously complex, highly enmeshed relationship. When she was committed to Butler Hospital, he was suddenly violently unmoored.
He was a man left to navigate the world completely on his own for the very first time.
Exactly. And how did he process that trauma? By writing a confession he couldn't even admit was a confession.
Right. To admit the story was raw, personal trauma would be unbearable for him. The ultimate tragedy of the outsider isn't that the narrator discovers he is a rotting, animated corpse. The true horror, the payload that Lovecraft is delivering to us through this confession, is the realization that once you see your own dark alien nature, you can never again exist among those who are still men.
You are permanently exiled from humanity.
Which leaves us with a question that extends far beyond a 1921 manuscript.
What's that?
If self-knowledge is this destructive, what are the mirrors we are actively avoiding right now? We live in an era where we can curate our realities, our social spheres, and our identities with terrifying precision.
More than ever before.
We can build our own castles of antique books online, surrounding ourselves only with reflections that tell us we are the youthful heroes of the story. We never have to face the unyielding glass.
But the cost of that curated isolation is that we lose our humanity.
The most terrifying part of this file isn't that a monster exists. It's that given the choice between painful self-awareness and comfortable monstrousness, we will almost always choose the dark.